Hello everybody, my name is Manuez and welcome to another episode of Eternal Essentials. This time we're going to continue the Archetype series and it's time to talk about Midrange after we covered aggro in the first episode basically. Alright, so Midrange is, as the name implies, kind of like a middle ground between aggro and control. In a sense, the deck the archetype neither tries to close out the game as fast as possible, nor is it trying to like prolong it too much and play for the late game. So it basically shines in the mid game, while aggro decks shine in the early game and control decks shine and are strongest in the late game, as the name of midrange basically implies. So let's take, for example, the Stone Scar midrange deck that I recorded quite some time ago. That's like a nice example of like a fairly typical mid-range deck and should serve as one of the examples right now to highlight some aspects. So usually what you will see is the curve, especially the unit curve in mid-range decks, will most of the time be higher than in aggressive decks. There's usually no 1-drops and few 2-drops, and if there is 1-drops or 2-drops, they are usually either extremely powerful, like the best in their slot, and usually are good at like offense and defense, or provide some utility. Like for example, a 1-drop you will often see in mid-range decks is Initiative of the Sands, because it's not an aggressive 1-drop in the sense that it's like not meant to attack from turn 2 on and apply pressure, but what it does actually is something that midrange is very much interested in. It gets you quicker to your mid-game threats, for example your 3 and 4-drops, which is something midrange decks are very interested. And in that sense, Initiative of the Sands is only to some extent an actual unit. It's mostly just like power acceleration, and that's the part that makes it interesting for midrange decks. Other than that, most 2+ drop units, especially like 2-drop units in mid-range decks, are either very efficient, like for example, as you can see in shadow mid-range decks, that's usually Argent Instigator, because it's bigger than almost anything else on turn 2, therefore makes for a really good blocker against aggressive decks, and at the same time, since it is the biggest in its slot, makes for a good attacker against other mid-range decks, especially slower mid-range decks, and in particular control decks, because against control decks, a mid-range deck sort of turns into the aggressor. But more on that later. So usually the units you will see in like early units you will see in mid-range decks are cards like Argent Instigator, Awakened Student, Desert Marshal, because it's like almost like removal and provides a lot of utility, Recano Artisan, sometimes Champion of Glory, stuff like that, like the best of the best that have good offense and defense potential and or provide some great utility, like Desert Marshal for example, or Recano Artisan. Although, don't be mistaken, Armory is not a mid-range deck. Armory is a control deck, but there's some mid-range decks that still play Recano Artisan, some Recano mid-range brews and stuff like that. And a lot of what I said right now regarding like either very powerful and like the best in terms of stats and overall strengths in their curve slot, or providing a lot of utility, is kind of generally the theme that you will see in mid-range decks, especially in like these classic good stuff mid-range decks that are not like synergy based, but are just like a mix of good disruptive interactive cards, removal, sabotage, stuff like that, and very efficient units. These decks usually run a lot less units than most aggressive decks. As you can see, this for example only runs 18 units. This deck got a lot worse with the Champion of Chaos nerf, because Champion of Chaos lost a lot of its defensive capabilities, which makes it a lot worse as a mid-range unit, because now the card is mostly like an aggressive card and not an aggressive and defensive card, which is something that Midrange is very interested in, since while 3 health on turn 2 is great, 3 health on turn 3 on a 3-drop is much worth, because suddenly you are trading with a bunch of 2-drops and a lot more cards than before, and it's a lot worth it stabilizing. Then like other things like these 4-drops, as you can see, they are chosen for their utility, not for their stats. Deadly and high health makes them particularly good blockers, but still reasonable attackers, especially Maiden's ability generating additional +2/+2 stats wherever they are needed makes her in the long term still a good threat and a good attacker, but first and foremost, especially the turn she comes down, a very good defensive unit, which is exactly the type of unit you want in midrange. Like Impending Doom is sometimes also played in midrange, but not that often, especially not in like very classic mid-range, in the sense that it's like not an aggressive mid-range deck, it's just like a very like middle ground mid-range deck that is neither trying to be particularly aggressive nor super controlling, and just mostly looks for like quality and utility. Especially because the ping of Impending Doom puts you like under pressure against aggro decks, and kind of makes it awkward to leave Impending Doom behind as a blocker, and then if they don't have good attacks, they just won't attack into it, so they won't lose a board unnecessarily, and you keep losing a health per turn, and that is kind of like not what you want from your blocker. So most of the time you see these like these strong utility units instead. Umbran Reaper is also like a nice mid-range fit, in the sense that it's once again good on offense, but also pretty nice on defense. 5 health means it trades with a lot of big units, and in the process we even gain 4 health and apply some pressure by draining the opponent for 5. So as you can see, the theme here is with these types of mid-range decks that their units need to be very powerful, since when we are not trying to end the game as fast as possible and like go towards like the late mid game, maybe even early late game, we need quality. Like each card that we draw needs to have as much impact on the game as possible, needs to matter as much as possible, unlike for example these random 1 power 2 ones in an aggro deck, which on their own don't matter too much. They only matter in the context of the deck, but as a card in like sort of a vacuum, they are like weak cards. While most cards here are like very strong in a vacuum and are as much as you can imagine to get for their cost, basically, which is one of the like key characteristics in like these good stuff mid-range decks, these non-synergy driven mid-range decks, because unlike a control deck, these decks usually don't have that many ways to generate raw card advantage, so they need to make up for that in power level, basically. So usually these decks are like a mix of all these like hyper efficient, super strong units that are at the same time good offensive and good defensive. They have like usually the flexibility of being either or, depending on what the situation and the matchup asks for, which is very important as well. And then you have a lot of removal, like as you can see here, this deck has like 9, 11 removal, plus some relic weapons that also can serve as removal, but also as threats, which is another great flexibility. As you can see, more cards that basically fit the offense-defense bill, like they can protect us from opposing threats, but they can also pressure an opponent as a threat on an empty board, like in a control deck, for example, that has no unit in play. So once again, offense-defense dichotomy, basically. Then these mid-range decks often have a lot of like inbuilt value to make up for like the lack of raw card draw, raw card advantage. Like here, for example, there's like Varus Favor and Monument to compensate for the much higher amount of power relative to like an aggro deck. An aggro deck usually gets away with running 25 to 28 or 29 power, while mid-range decks of this type usually need like 32, sometimes even 33, between like favors, seeks, and actual power. And in order to like counterbalance that, you need like favors and monuments to not flood out too much. So basically once you hit your 5 or 6 power, you have some added value from your power by your monuments turning into units and stuff. And like inbuilt card advantage ways like Smuggler's Stash help a bit with this, but most of the time like mid-range decks will have none or very few raw card advantage cards, because they have the problem that they are not that great in the mid game. They are only like really good for a deck that plans for the late game and is very reactive usually, because a mid-range deck still cares enough about tempo that it cannot do like too dirtly stuff. If you just take off a turn, for example turn 3, to play Wisdom of the Elders rather than impact the board, that is basically bad against aggro, because against aggro you cannot like afford to waste like that much tempo early on, because then you get run over. And against control it's the same thing for another reason. Basically they are the deck that the clock is running for, not against. The clock is running against the mid-range deck in that matchup, because the mid-range deck becomes the aggressor. So if you take time off impacting the board, pressuring the opponent, and like to draw some extra cards, that's exactly the game the control deck wants to play. They want to prolong the game because their deck is going bigger than ours, and their deck is like planning for the game to go long, while ours is trying to eventually end the game in like the late mid game, early late game, basically when the control deck really starts to get into it. So basically in both prospective matchups, that's not what you want to be doing as mid-range. As mid-range you basically kind of want to be slightly bigger than the control deck, than the aggro deck, to try and like one-up them and like outclass them, take over the game and then turn the game on them and win the game. And against control you want to be smaller enough than them to still be able to make a reasonable aggro deck impression to win the game, while slower than an actual aggro deck, still before the control deck really takes over the game. And that is often, if it is possible, it's usually possible because every card in the deck like matters so much that the deck is capable to quickly like run away with the game if one of the cards remains unanswered. But in general it can be said that mid-range is much stronger against aggro and much weaker against control. So like normally the rock paper scissors of these three archetypes is aggro beats control, control beats mid-range, mid-range beats aggro. But that's like only a guideline because it very much depends on the decks in questions. There can easily be control decks that are so slow and late game oriented, and mid-range decks that have so much like aggressive potential that the mid-range deck is favored against the control deck. That very much depends on the kinds of control and mid-range decks and so on. But it's just like a rough idea. So what else regarding mid-range decks? One thing that is important usually to make up for like being slower, you need disruption, ways to like cripple and falter the opponent's game plan, which in these shadow mid-range decks usually means sabotage, because aggro decks usually have some very cheap, efficient ways to gain tempo and blow you out, like for example Torch to kill the Champion of Chaos, Suffocate to kill Statuary Maiden, stuff like that, a good way, or just like Rapid Shot to punish whatever blocker with just one power, and Sabotage is a great way to avoid that. You can Sabotage, take away their Rapid Shot, now you can safely block with your bigger unit, and the opponent, the aggro deck, is in like a tough spot where they might not have good attacks. Plus, if they have multiple things, now you know if they have something else and what else they have, so you can properly play around it. So it gives you information and avoids like these tempo swings from the aggro deck. And against control, there's a lot of like card advantage cards and game breakers like Smuggler's Dash, Great Parliament, and so on, that you can take with Sabotage, or like Harsh Rule, for example, that you can take with Sabotage and also gain the information like what they have, like what spells and attachments they are working with. So once again, you have additional information that allows you to make right decisions. Like for example, if you see like a Harsh Rule in a Great Parliament, and you maybe take the Great Parliament, you know, okay, they definitely have a Harsh Rule, so you have to play accordingly. Or if you take the Harsh Rule, you have to be able to like end the game before that Great Parliament punishes you too much, and so on. I think this is like a very important element for these mid-range decks to be really good and work in both matchups, because otherwise you might just get like tempo blown out too much by aggro decks, and especially too much like overpowered by these game breaking cards from the control decks, because you have to compensate for not being fast enough to be an aggro deck and not being slow enough and value oriented enough to be a control deck by basically denying your opponent to do that as well. Like Sabotage basically takes away a lot of like the tempo aggressive potential from aggro decks, and at the same time a lot of like the late game potential from control decks, basically, and putting them closer to your level and forcing them to play our game, basically, which is exactly what the mid-range deck wants and needs, to force the aggro or control deck to play a mid-range game that they are both not set up to do, while the mid-range deck is. And yeah, the removal is just like important to deal with all sorts of like problematic and especially like value units, since otherwise it will just turn into a standoff and both sides like kind of have to hope to like outdraw the opponent. So it's important to have enough answers to all these units that can easily take over the game, like Mystic Ascendant and stuff like that. And against aggro, you need enough like cheap removal to not get run over early before our defenses are set up. Let me think a moment. So yeah, basically with all the answers, like one important thing is you need enough answers, but there is always like too many answers. Like if you play too many answers, too much removal, then you can easily end up with the problem of like drawing too much removal against control decks, and if you don't run enough removal, you can easily end up with like drawing too little, especially cheap removal against aggro decks and get run over. So this balance is like pretty delicate, and sometimes mid-range decks have like this issue of like drawing the wrong half of their deck depending on what mid-range you have and how the mid-range deck looks. And Stone Scar is particularly good at not having these issues for multiple reasons. One being Quarry. Quarry is like a great card that is very flexible and allows you to find cheap removal if you need cheap removal early against aggro, but it also allows you to like discard that removal spell you find in it and like take a threat or sabotage against the control deck or another mid-range deck, for example. So it allows you to virtually have more access to your threats and to your answers without being like stuck with either or. Because like if you wouldn't have Quarry, maybe you would have to play like 2 removal and 2 more units in its place, and then the chance of drawing removal when you need a unit and drawing a unit when you need removal is much higher. The other thing is relic weapons. Relic weapons are great because they virtually up your removal count. Like these 5 relic weapons give us 5 additional removal. But at the same time, they're never gonna be dead because they can also hit our opponent. So if our opponent doesn't have units that we want or need to removal, we can just hit their face on an empty board and they are just as good as units. So basically in the whole like mid-range game plan, they are perfect at being a threat when we need a threat most of the time, and being a removal when we need a removal. That allows the Stone Scar. These are like 2 card types that allow the Stone Scar mid-range deck to more often have the right answer if they need an answer, but not sit there, but at the same time not sit there too often with like answers in hand when all we want is something to like pressure the opponent before he like gets back into the game. That is one of the like big upsides of like Stone Scar midrange over other shadow-based midrange decks that don't have that luxury. Which is why this deck was so good before Champion of Chaos got nerfed, because it had like this great consistency and balance of its aspects, and all these cards were like very good offensive and defense. If Champion of Chaos would have been turned into a 4/4 instead of a 5/3, this deck would still be great. Since it is now a 5/3, I think this deck is like much worse than it used to be, and not a particularly great choice anymore. But it's still like is a great way to show these good stuff mid-range aspects. There is although there is like some other type of mid-range deck, like these like good stuff mid-range decks usually curve up to like 5 or 6, usually have like a bunch of 5 drops, and at 6 usually like 3 to 4 6 drops or something, and that's usually the top of the curve, because since you are a mid-range deck and you don't want the game to go to like the late game, you also don't want to play late game cards, because they will only become like relevant at a point in the game where we usually want the game to end, because there's other decks that perform better in that stage of the game, control decks. So the Obelisk Combre deck that we talked about last time in aggro is actually to some extent more of an aggressive mid-range deck than an actual aggro deck. Like if we look at it, the deck is simply not aggressive enough to end the game very quickly. It also doesn't have enough tools to constantly attack on any board and stuff, because it doesn't have that much removal. So it is kind of forced into playing this mid-range game, which is also why there is like a bunch of these cards that are good in the mid game, or even in like the late mid game, early late game. Seraph, Student with its Empower, Obelisk with its Threshold at 8, Parliament with the Threshold at 8, and so on. And yeah, this is sort of like another type of these Obelisk decks are usually like sort of another type of mid-range deck that also like even go a little higher, since they potentially go up to 8. Like even Shimmer Pack is ultimately, in my opinion, a mid-range deck. It has like this combo finish with Shimmer Pack and stuff, but it doesn't make it a combo deck. It's basically just one of these synergy-driven mid-range decks that I mentioned. Like it's not a good stuff mid-range deck, it is a synergy-driven mid-range deck, and the synergy is mostly like around Xenon Obelisk and Shimmer Pack. Like it plays all these cards that get better with get improved by Obelisk and Shimmer Pack, and are like not that good by themselves, aside from like Sandstorm Titan basically and Scouting Party, but most of the cards are there to work towards Obelisk and or Shimmer Pack. And yeah, the deck relies on these like 2 to 3 cards to actually win the game usually. And yeah, this is like a mid-range deck that mostly goes up to 6, as we can see. There's like 4 6 drops, sometimes there's like 5 or so, or 6, like 1 or 2 Carnosaurs extra. And then there's like the Shimmer packs. And there's like Initiative of the Sands, which kind of like helps you often like drop Shimmer pack on turn 7 already, so a little earlier. Since we are mid-range deck, we usually want to end the game before like the super late game, because in the super late game the control decks can potentially beat us. It's a bit harder against these obelisk decks because they're actually pretty resilient against control decks. And yeah, there's all these cards that are pretty weak but work towards these synergies, like all these like weak units that get turned into threats by obelisk and Shimmer pack. An alternative approach to this, as we all know, is like Elysian mid-range that sort of employs like a similar plan, but less synergy driven. It's just more of like curving out with like the most powerful, efficient units in its curve drop. Like we have like a 5/5 for 3, we have a 5/6 for 4, we have a 6/6 overwhelm that is hard to block for 5, and then we have like one of the best 6 drops in the game, especially if you're running Xenon Obelisk and Scouting Party. So this is like a very proactive mid-range strategy in the sense that it runs a lot less answers than like the like balanced good stuff mid-range type approach that we saw from these shadow aggro decks, shadow mid-range decks. This is more of a like bigger aggro deck in the sense like it's not as fast as an actual aggro deck, but the plan is still sort of the same. It just tries to curve out with units, but it curves higher and the units are more powerful, and tries to like overwhelm the opponent in the mid game with its dominant board presence, because this deck will usually have like the most dominant and biggest board in the game, and therefore allows it to like be a mid-range deck rather than an aggro deck, because it outclasses what most other decks do in the mid game. But yeah, this is like a more aggressive approach to mid-range. We see if there's like anything else that I need to touch on. I don't think so. Like to show an alternative shadow mid-range deck, there's like the Feln mid-range deck they talked about. So you can see here, this deck basically lacks the whole flexibility of relic weapons. Therefore, it has to run more like actual removal, which can be lackluster, because while Torch can be pointed at the opponent, cards like Permafrost can't. So if your opponent just doesn't play that many units, you will more often sit there with like virtually dead hand cards, which is a problem, and a problem that I had in the past with this deck. And since you can only like play so many removal spells and don't get like to the same redundancy of answers as the Stone Scar deck with weapons, this deck also plays more units and more aggressive units. Like it is a close call between Impending Doom and Steward in this deck, but the tendency was lately towards Doom, simply to have like this 1-2-3 punch Air Force of like Gale into Doom into Champion of Cunning, to try and like overwhelm the opponent in the air in the mid game before they get to the actual late game. Since once again this deck cannot beat a control deck in the late game. It can beat a control deck before it gets to the actual late game, but it cannot usually go toe to toe with a control deck in the late game. Scouting Party sometimes makes a good impression of that, and Bloodcaster, but the control deck usually will have more ways to like outcard and outgrind us than we do. So yeah, that's like a different take on the whole plan. A little more aggressive due to some lack of answers, and also because the deck kind of just like has heavier hitting good stuff units like Champion of Cunning, so it makes a bit more sense to play Impending Doom. And the life gain from Midnight Gale also compensates a bit for like the damage taken from Impending Doom. And it's also like kind of a matchup specific choice to fly over these obelisk decks with Impending Doom, for example, that have a lot of ground pounders usually. And once again, as you can see, curve usually stops at 6. Then we have like 26 to 27 power, some seeks, favors, and a lot of monuments to make sure that even though we have a lot of power and need to hit our 6 on curve a lot of the time, we at the same time don't flat out much beyond that and actually can start playing our excess power as for flyers, which is pretty powerful. That's one of the sort of strengths of the mid-range decks that control decks don't have. Like control decks usually need like 32 to 35 power, and they cannot really afford to play many monuments. First of all, they don't matter too much in the context of their game plan, and second of all, they slow them down too much, while the mid-range deck can accommodate them much better and also can make much better use of the thing they turn into. So the mid-range deck kind of gets to run a lot of like hidden value and incremental value built in that to some extent makes up for like the lack of raw card advantage engines. So maybe let's sum it up real quick at the end. So mid-range decks, unlike aggro decks, try to win in the mid-game to early late game. They sort of take the control role against aggro decks and the aggro role against control decks. Their curve usually goes up to like 5 to 6, in some cases even up to 8, especially in like obelisk synergy driven decks, since obelisk kind of naturally wants you to hit 8 in a timely manner. Then usually, at least in like the non-synergy driven cases, there's basically good stuff decks that just try to like play the best and most powerful and most efficient cards in its curve slot to try and make up for actual card advantage engines by quality, basically, that simply like all cards that you draw with a mid-range deck have as much of an impact as they possibly can on the game, and are on average stronger than the cards that, say, an aggro opponent presents. And at the same time, the mid-range deck is usually looking for flexibility and utility over like raw stats, as you saw. Cards like Steward of the Past and Statuary Maiden are usually preferable over cards like Impending Doom, for example, which has a lot more raw stats for a 4-drop, but a lot less flexibility and provides no utility whatsoever, basically. And then it's also important to have as much incremental advantage as you can have by playing cards like Monuments, especially in these good stuff mid-range decks, like Monuments and Favors, to be able to play the amount of power that the deck needs, which is a lot higher than an aggro deck, but at the same time don't flat out too much if the game goes a little longer. Most pure card advantage cards are not what a mid-range deck usually runs and wants, because they waste too much time against aggro and run the risk of you getting run over, and against control, trying to play their game is only gonna make us lose, because the longer the game goes, the more the control deck is favored. So against aggro decks, we don't have the time to not impact the board because we are under pressure, and against control it's the same, just that we are the ones applying the pressure and having to apply the pressure because the clock is running against the mid-range deck in that matchup. So anything else that I need to cover? I think that should sum everything up so far. Basically, when you're playing and building mid-range decks, when building, it's important to make sure that the deck is flexible and is actually able to assume the role that it has to in the matchup that it is in. And it's particularly important when playing mid-range to identify the role that you have to take, to look for whether you are supposed to be the control deck or the aggro deck in a matchup. Since misidentifying your role in a given matchup will most likely lead to a loss, because if you're trying to play for the long game when your opponent is better at the long game, you're gonna lose. If you're trying to race a deck that's better at racing than us, you're also gonna lose. And that also comes in when building the deck, because if your deck is not like flexible enough in assuming these roles, then you're already incapable of doing what you need to do to win the matchup, and are most likely not gonna win that type of matchup very often. Like if your mid-range deck is like pretty bad at defense, then you will lose a lot to aggro decks, which you shouldn't. And if your deck is like too bad at disruption and reasonably curving out and applying pressure, then you will probably lose to control decks that you give enough time and then their superior late game will just beat us. Alright, I think that covers everything that I have to say about mid-range as an archetype for now. Once again, if there's any unclarities, since these things are kind of unscripted and I just kind of improvise and go through my thoughts and ideas. If there's any questions, let me know in the comments. I'm happy to answer anything that is still unclear. And as usual, if you found this interesting and or helpful, please like and subscribe, and follow me on social media for more frequent updates. That's it for this Eternal Essentials. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye.